Great, thank you. I really appreciate being here today. It's not every day I get the opportunity to be up in front of this many farmers and agency people, so I really appreciate it. So I'm originally from Northern California, up in the high desert, where if you don't have irrigation, then you're not going to be growing anything. So when I first moved out here in 2010, I was really surprised at how successful some of the dryland farmers are, especially considering some of the really low organic matter sandy soils that you guys are working with. I started working with MS Consulting fall of 2010, just doing soil sampling, a lot of grid sampling at the time, and really kind of getting frustrated with how labor intensive that operation was and how poor it was in some instances at actually representing in-field variability. And so we started looking at some of these other mapping tools and options that were out there for delineating and classifying different soil types, changes in soil moisture, different productivity areas and stuff like that. And that's really been a focus of my work with MS Consulting, especially over the last 10 years or so. So MS Consulting, if you aren't familiar with it, is based out of Little Falls. There's also a Paynesville location. We work with about 110,000 acres right now, mostly providing traditional crop consulting services like soil sampling, scouting, but increasingly digital agronomy services like analyzing and processing satellite imagery, terrain analysis, surface flow modeling, and ultimately creating variable rate files for changing rates of seed, fertilizer, and irrigation throughout the same field. Most of the crops that we work with are just corn and soybeans, but increasingly getting into potatoes. We worked with dry beans for a long time, but seeing more specialty crops, especially peas and sweet corn. And the bulk of our territory is in central Minnesota. We've got maybe 6,000 acres in North Dakota. I work with some consultants in South Dakota and other places to help enable their consulting programs with some of the digital agronomy stuff that we do. And all in all, we work with about 40,000 acres of irrigated farmland, almost entirely pivot irrigation systems. So before we get into the meat and potatoes, I want to touch real briefly on management zone theory, because it's a big part that's underlying this whole process of informing variable rate applications. And there's a lot of misconceptions that I find in the industry around how to create management zones and how to implement that program. There's a big assumption that yield maps and yield data is really the main thing that we need to break apart these different management zones in the field. And yield is important, but yield maps specifically themselves don't tell us what the yield limiting variables are as they change throughout a field. So a common example that we run into is that you take multiple years of yield maps, you average that data out, and let's say, just to keep the numbers simple, your really dry spots average 100 bushels of corn, your really wet spots average 100 bushels of corn. So on that multi-year yield analysis, those two spots look the same, which implies that they should be treated the same, even though the differences in soil moisture dictate that they'd be managed differently. And even if you're working with the best maps and data, you really need to understand the agronomics behind what that data means. You need to understand the genetics of the crops you're working with, the environment that you're dealing with, And the environment is really the confluence of the different soils, topography, and weather or climate, and your management limitations. And you need to understand how all those three things interact before you can implement a successful variable rate strategy. And accurate maps and an agronomically sound management zone strategy can enable the application of the variable rate application of a lot of different inputs. Most commonly corn seed, fertilizers, soil amendments like limestone and gypsum, crop protectants, and variable rate irrigation. And really what's needed to enable those applications are management zones that reflect changes in soils, relief, topography, and especially soil moisture. Because soil moisture drives a lot of different processes in the soil, chemical and biological processes. And with regards to soil moisture management, there are two basic ways that we're tackling this. Through active soil moisture management, things like variable rate irrigation or drain tiling, where we are directly adding or taking away water from these systems, and passive soil moisture management, where we are adjusting the rates of our other inputs to accommodate what differences in soil moisture we have in a field. And going back to just the whole concept of management zones, the reason that I'm leaning on that so heavily is because it's rare that you can take one map and have that accurately reflect all the different variables that you need to be managing around. What you ultimately need to do is you need to find different maps that have complementary strengths and weaknesses, and combine those maps in geographic information systems to create the strongest spatial representation of how your yield limiting factors vary. So a lot of these talks, soil surveys, soil map units come up. This can be a really good starting point, especially if you're taking on new ground where you have no experience. There's a lot of really detailed tabular data in these Sergo map units. That means that within each map, there's a description, a detailed description of a lot of different attributes to that soil. These maps are really easy to access. They're available online. They're inexpensive. You really don't have to pay for them up front. They've essentially already been paid for with your tax dollars, or your dad's tax dollars, your parents' tax dollars. The problem with them is that the spatial resolution it's too coarse for what we want to accomplish within specific fields. Also notice that we're not talking about soil type maps, we're talking about soil map units. And I forget the exact percentage on it, but any one map unit could be up to, I think, 40% different soil types than what's described in the label. So here's a side-by-side comparison of the field over in Isanti County. The left is the Sergo soil map units. That's what these black lines represent. On the right are the management zones that were part of our Smart 4D zone creation process. And I just want to point out the difference in the granularity, how tightly the management zones on the right hug the different soils in terms of soil brightness. You can see some lighter and darker soils. And on the map on the left, it's not quite as detailed. This is another example here. This is irrigated sand over in Royalton. Soil survey map units on the bottom with the management zones kind of contrasting that at the top. And you can see some really conspicuous differences in soil color that the map at the top accurately depicts, but only sort of loosely depicts in the soil survey map units. If at any time you guys have questions on any of this stuff, feel free to raise a hand or something. It's a good chance for me to take a break. Elevation maps, I use a lot. This is a really valuable data set for managing soil moisture, but it's also one of the most commonly misused data sets that I see. The overwhelming assumption is that the higher ground on the elevation map is always the drier ground, lower ground is always the wetter ground. That isn't always the case though. We can have features like upland depressions. On the elevation map, it's high ground, but it's a depression, so it actually collects water. It's wetter, and it needs to be managed differently than what the elevation map suggests. But these elevation maps are a primary ingredient in things like surface flow modeling, which accurately and in great detail depicts how water moves across the surface of the field when you have a runoff event. And this surface flow model, there's a lot of different surface flow models out there. One of the most common ones, and that's gaining a lot more attention recently, is the topographic wetness index. And this is an accurate representation of where the water goes when it runs off of a field. It's really pretty easy to produce if you have accurate high detail elevation maps, but you do need to have a little bit of technical expertise in order to turn that elevation map into a topographic wetness index. And for Minnesota and North Dakota, we have really good quality elevation data to build these types of models off of. And some of the drawbacks are that surface flow of water isn't the only way that soil moisture can vary within a field. And so this layer alone isn't going to get you all the way to where you want to be if you're going to want to accurately manage your own soil moisture on every acre. So an example would be that in climates where you have heavy rainfall events or soils with low infiltration rates, surface flow is going to be a greater form of moisture variability than in a scenario where you have a climate with low rainfall events or high infiltration rates. Because if that water goes down through the soil surface, it's not going to move laterally across the surface of the soil as much. So here we have a 3D elevation model, and on the left we have the elevation map colorized and draped over that 3D model. So you can see the hills towards the right and the lower ground towards the left. On the right, contrasting that, we have the topographic wetness index, where we have colored areas that shed water, red, and areas that collect water is blue. So you can see that you get some upland depressions on the right that collect water that aren't necessarily as conspicuous on the elevation map. Another data set that is increasingly accessible. It's been around for decades, but various connectivity mapping or electromagnetic induction mapping can be ways where you accurately delineate changes in soil moisture. These are usually ground-driven sensors that you attach to a sled or a vehicle. You pull them across the field on set increments, usually 40 to 60 foot swaths. And they use changes in electrical conductivity of the soil to imply changes in soil moisture, because wetter soils conduct electricity better than drier soils. One of the drawbacks of this particular technology is that there are other things than soil moisture that can drive changes in the electromagnetic properties of the soil. Things like salinity can be a big one, soil temperature, soil texture, and then non-soil things that happen to interfere with mapping, like rocks and crop residue. The main sensors that I see in the industry are Varus, which is a disc type of electrical conductivity card, and the EM38, which is usually attached to a sled or vehicle mounted above the soil, so it's not actually contacting the soil. Bare soil imagery. There's a lot of different ways to use bare soil imagery. I'm going to specifically touch on radiometric analysis. That's where we use geographic information software to actually quantify how light or how dark a soil is based on properly timed bare soil imagery. And so the underlying premise there is that darker soils typically have one or two things in common, that they are higher organic matter or wetter than brighter soils. And using digital imagery, we can map those out and quantify those at a very high resolution. It's probably the highest resolution soil variability data that we have available. And it's incredibly accessible. It's really inexpensive. There's a lot of historic public data sets that we can access. We're really the only cost that we incur is just in the manpower of sorting through different scenes and applying the right type of analysis to those scenes to create maps that reflect relative changes in soil organic matter and soil moisture. But it takes a fair amount of experience to be trained in on identifying the proper timing of those scenes and the right analysis to apply to the imagery to make it useful in a way that you can then inform variable rate inputs like variable rate irrigation. And it's also pretty limited by your tillage format. So strip till or conservation tillage, no-till, where you don't have any bare soil exposed, you obviously can't image that with a drone or satellite. And you're only directly measuring the brightness of a very shallow horizon of soil. But the idea here is that you have access to bare soil because there's been tillage involved, and tillage is a mixing of the soil, and so then that shallow layer is actually an amalgam of a deeper horizon. That does make sense from a management perspective. Here I'm comparing and contrasting an electrical conductivity map on the top and a management zone map that was based mostly off of bare soil imagery. Both of these maps are overlaid on a 3D model of the elevation or the topography of the field. And you can see that there's a lot of similarities, where the higher ground is often depicted as drier. And I should back up here because the red on both of these maps reflects drier soils. And then as you get into the cooler colors, the greens, the blues, and finally the dark blue and the purple, those are the wettest soils. Where the electrical conductivity kind of struggled in this scenario, that this was a very dry spring, coarse sandy soil. And when we got into some of these areas at the top here that are primarily red, once you get below about 20% volumetric soil water, the bare spark has a hard time running a current through that. And so we had a bunch of values where it just wasn't mapping at all because the soil was too dry to conduct electricity. Whereas when we were using the bare soil aerial imagery at the bottom map, we could pick and choose historic scenes where soil moisture was more ideal for that mapping application, and we could create more detailed features within those dry areas. Here I have, again, the same maps, the zone maps on the right, which were created using mostly bare soil imagery. On the left would be the zones from the electrical conductivity map. And the only thing that I'm really trying to point out here is that generally we have a very similar representation of how things are changing across the field, according to both mapping approaches. We maybe have a little bit more detail with the aerial imagery, where we were excessively dry. A lot of those differences kind of got washed out with the electrical conductivity map. Thermal imagery has a lot of similar weaknesses to bare soil imagery, whereas you kind of need to be looking at the exposed soil itself in order to do a good job mapping any changes in soil moisture. And the premise behind that is that moisture, water, has a much higher specific heat than anything else in the soil. So all things being equal, cooler parts of the field are going to be wetter than warmer parts of the field, which are going to be drier. So the drier parts of the field are going to warm up a lot faster than the cooler, wetter parts. I do think that if you're going to do a good job trying to reflect soil moisture with thermal imagery, I think timing is going to be more sensitive than some of the other mapping methods. We really haven't leaned too heavily on thermal imagery in the past for that reason. But I thought it was noteworthy because I think there is maybe some potential for that. NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, basically just an acronym for Plant Health Maps, which is a really accurate and consistent way to map changes in plant health, but plant health can be affected by a number of factors, not always soil moisture. So you have to be really careful about the timing of when these maps are collected and have a pretty good set of information about what has happened in that field. Are you really looking at differences in how soil moisture is affecting the crop? Or was there something else that happened that might also be impacting plant health, like maybe compaction? But there is a pretty extensive historic set for satellite and manned aerial imagery. And it's all pretty cheap to access. One of the main deficiencies of plant health maps is really similar to the scenario that I depicted with yield maps, in that they can be pretty ambiguous as to what's actually driving crop health or driving yield within a field. So this map that I have here it's a 3D topography model with a colorized plant health map draped on top of it, where the red colors are just poor crop health. The blue and purple are areas of healthier, more vigorous crop. And what I want to point out here is that the dry parts of the field look very similar to the wet parts of the field. That's a problem from a variable rate management perspective. They're classified similarly or the same but they need to be managed in very different ways. Relatively new to the game are microwave sensors. When these first came out, they were mounted on pivots facing the direction that the pivot was mounted, and you could use that look ahead then to adjust the rates of irrigation as the pivot was moving across the field. One thing that is potentially nice about this compared to some of the other methods that I mentioned is that it's possible to calculate or estimate actual absolute values of soil moisture with these types of sensors. Whereas with everything else that I mentioned, we're really only looking at relative differences. And I don't have any personal experience with this. I have talked with the founder of this company here a little bit over the last couple of years. And I think there's potential with this technology. I mentioned that they were pivot mounted. They recently started putting them on drones, so you can run the drone over the field and create soil moisture maps that way. So just to back up and touch on what I mean by relative and absolute data values, everything else that we talked about looks at relative values, which is a really simplistic way. We're looking at things in terms of wet versus dry, but we aren't attributing specific values to that. Whereas when we get into absolute values, we're looking at percent volumetric water content or inches of water per depth of soil. And like I alluded to earlier, it's rare that you can take one map and accurately inform a variable rate application based off of that one map alone. Oftentimes we have to look at the situation, the soils, the climate, the management practices, the crop that's being grown, and identify complementary maps that are going to optimize your spatial definition. And what that means in practice is taking these different data sets, these different maps, like I have on the outside here, and putting them together in an intelligent way that makes agronomic sense into one map that is the management zone map. And that is the map in the middle here. And so in this specific example, where I've got the management zone map overlaid on top of a 3D elevation model, our red and orange zones are low organic matter soils. They dry out pretty fast. And because of their slope, they shed water really fast in a rainfall event, and they're really high risk for erosion. As we get into the green zones, those are more even terrain, flatter. They slowly shed water. They typically are sort of the Goldilocks zone for a field. That means that they're not too hot, they're not too cold, they're not too wet, they're not too dry. And from a risk management perspective, those are your most consistent yielding areas. So there's lower risk and typically higher profit potential over time. As you get into these blue and purple areas in this example, these are heavier, wetter soils. Very high risk for flood stress. You're very likely to have stressful emergence conditions after planting. To use corn seeding rates as an example, we're going to be dropping our corn seeding rates in the red zones and gradually increasing those seeding rates as we move into the green and blue and finally purple zones. And here's just another way to visualize those management zones using in-season color infrared imagery, where the more dense vegetation and crop growth is red. You can kind of see some bare soil patches in there. So the top map is the management zone map. The bottom map is the soil survey. This is just another way to visualize what the zones mean in terms of soil and topography variability. So on the left here we have an elevation model with the zone map draped over it. So again, the red zones are lower organic matter, drier soils. As you get into the green, the blue, and finally the purple, you have increasing amounts of soil organic matter, increasing amounts of soil moisture. And one thing that's really cool about mapping soil moisture, because soil moisture drives so much in the soil, when you map soil moisture, you aren't just delineating soil moisture trends, you're also often delineating trends in soil organic matter, exchange capacity, fertility, and nutrient use efficiency. So generally, as soil moisture increases, your potential to grow more biomass in that spot increases. As you produce more biomass, your potential over time to increase soil organic matter increases. As soil organic matter increases, your potential to hold on to more soil moisture, because soil organic matter acts as a sponge, increases the potential for plant available water. But also as soil organic matter increases, your potential to release through mineralization nutrients like nitrogen, sulfur, and to a lesser extent potassium and phosphorus also increases. And then because organic matter contributes, has humus in it, humus contributes to the exchange sites of the soil. So as water increases, organic matter increases. As organic matter increases, exchange capacity increases, and so does the ability of the soil to hold on to calcium, magnesium, potassium. So your soil fertility also increases. And we start to see trends like this. And this is a relatively low variability irrigated black sand in Morrison County. You can see the soil samples, top right, pulled from this field. The zone map on the left is, again, draped over the elevation model. So the high, dry zones are represented in red. The lower, wetter zones are represented in purple. And we actually quantified the amount of soil moisture by zone. So you can see, as we go H2O% by weight, 6.9 all the way down to 14%. The CEC, that's the exchange capacity, also goes from low to high. Organic matter goes from low to high. Sulfur, generally the same. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, similar trend again. We see this in the vast majority, this trend we see in the vast majority of fields that we zone sample with this type of management zone approach. So one thing I want to touch on, because we talked about the maps, and that maps are really just a part of this decision-making process, we also need to determine, does a particular field make sense to variable rate irrigation? And there's a few different ways that you can look about or assess that. Boots in the field, so crop scouting, especially during dry weather scenario. Aerial imagery, which might help to tease out drownouts or areas that are under drought stress. Yield maps potentially can be used for that end. And then the question that I get a lot is, does it make sense for this field to be variable rated? Does it make sense to be variable rated by speed control or through emitter level control? There's a lot of pivots out there that are all ready to go for speed control, but to get to that next level, the emitter level control can require a significant investment. So one of the things we should look at is is answering the question, do we have enough variability out there to even justify varying the rate of irrigation water? So all things being equal, the field on the left has a much greater range in soil moisture variability than the field on the right. So if I had limited funds to work with, I would focus investing on the infrastructure on the field on the left. But that doesn't answer, do we need speed control or do we need to upgrade to emitter level control? And so one of the things that we do to help put some more concrete numbers to that is that we take the management zone maps that we've created that depict the changes in soil moisture, and we compare those to that speed control scenario. So we create another zone map that reflects how the pivot can actually vary the rates of irrigation across that field. And in this example, we have 88% agreement between the natural variation in soil moisture and how the pivot can change water just using speed control alone. So it's unlikely that you're going to get a big return on investment to upgrade this particular system to emitter level control when you're already getting that good of a spatial accuracy. This is a half swing pivot where we did the same process, and we only came up with 44% agreement between how speed control would vary water compared to the natural variability of soil moisture. And so it still makes sense in some sectors to maybe slow down or speed up the pivot, but on average, the optimal way to vary water on that field would be through emitter level control. And here we're just playing around with different scenarios looking at section control. So I go from one section, basically just speed control, to 4 sections. And when we were at just that one section, we were accounting for about 60% of the natural variability of soil moisture just through speed control. And ultimately, when we got to 4 sections, we were up to about 80% of spatial accuracy. There's a lot of different irrigation strategies out there for how much water to apply. One of my challenges has been to keep things accurate, but also simple enough that farmers can just press a button and run with their strategy. One of the approaches that I implemented here was to come up with basically 2 different prescriptions depending on the scenario for this variable rate emitter level control system. And so what's going on here is that we have one big system that's sandwiched in between 2 other pivots, and only the middle pivot is equipped with emitter level control. And so what we're doing is we are turning off those emitters where they overlap with the other systems. And that's what you see with these black crescents on the right and top left of that map. The other black features here are our swamp area that's not being farmed at all. So we are naturally turning off the emitters for that reason. And in the top map, we have what I call the if dry scenario. This is where it's really hot, wet, we're really struggling to keep up with soil moisture. We're basically putting on as much water as we can, keeping things running. Everything that's being farmed is getting watered in this if dry scenario. In the if wet scenario, it's just dry enough that you want to run the system to keep up with the driest parts of the field. And you don't want to overwater some of the lower, wetter parts of the field. And so that's why you see more of these, more black on the lower area, because we're shutting those nozzles off in more areas. So I think that pretty well gets us to time here. Maybe a couple minutes to spare. does anybody have any questions? It's kind of a lot to throw at you guys, especially after lunch. All right, well, thank you guys very much. I appreciate your time.